Basically, it started as a heat in my chest.
Back in season 1, David Yaden was a guest on this show, and he told me a story that stuck with me.
That heat spread over my entire body. And so as this is happening, I'm wondering what's going on here. And at some point, a voice in my mind said, "This is love." At which point I felt that went out of my body or into an inner space. I could see 360 degrees around me, this sort of intricate fabric stretching out. And that feeling of heat, which now I'm feeling as love, reached an absolute boiling point.
David wasn't in the middle of a religious ritual, and he wasn't doing any drugs. He was a young atheist in his freshman year of college, just lying on his dorm room bed.
And after what felt like months, but which was probably only a few minutes, I opened my eyes. My body was laughing and crying at the same time. And in the days and weeks afterwards, things around me seemed new, as if I had just been reborn into the world. This experience was and remains probably the most meaningful moment of my life.
Have you ever had an experience like this? I admit I haven't. But more people than you might think have. What David is describing here goes by many names. Self-transcendence, a mystical experience, even ego death. But whatever you choose to call it, what unites events like these are big feelings. Feelings of awe, of connection, and of fundamental truths revealed. For some, the route to these experiences is through religion. For others, like Yaden, it can be completely secular. But however you get there, everyone who's had them agrees the results are profound and often life-changing.
What I felt was more awe and wonder for the world, more fascinated in small things, and maybe this is the major thing, much more connected to family and friends.
Today, we'll talk with Professor David Yaden again. This time, about the research he's done on these mysterious experiences in the years since having his own. And we'll also talk to Dr. Robert Foreman, a professor of religion and author of many books on this topic, about whether and how religion fits into the picture.
I think the only difference between religion and just the guy that's in runner's high is that religious systems present themselves as having a way to get your life more in alignment with these experiences.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works.
Would you say that you have ever had a religious or mystical experience? That is, a moment of sudden religious insight or awakening? It's a question asked by Gallup. What percentage of the American population would you say would completely endorse that statement?
I would guess 25%.
So generally, when I ask this of audiences, I get everything from 5% to 95%, which in this case, the answer is about 35%.
David Yaden is a professor at the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, and one of the growing number of scientists who are studying self-transcendent experiences today.
To me, I would have been one of the ones to guess much lower. I would have thought maybe 5%, 10% of the population. So around 35% strikes me as quite high.
Yeah, I mean, you're basically at 1 out of 3, which is a pretty common experience. I think when most people, myself included, initially would think about mystical experiences, we think about yogis or Saint Teresa, these rare people who are cloistered away somewhere having these experiences. But if it's 1 out of 3, it means look to your left and look to your right next time you're on the subway or the bus.
It's interesting, about 40% of people who have had one of these experiences never tell another soul about them. And so I think that complicates our intuitions of how prevalent these experiences are. Now we get into this issue, though, of what are people really responding to the question in terms of. Some people, when we ask them to write about their experience, they'll say that they felt a sense of peace while they're on a walk. I mean, some people even say things like, well, I really wanted to find a good parking spot, and then I found one, and I felt that that was a spiritual experience.
In Boston it is. In Boston it is, my friend. Yeah.
Well, Baltimore too, really. But that's not the kind of intensely altered state of consciousness that's felt to be deeply meaningful and revealing something important about reality that usually researchers will have in mind when they think about a spiritual or mystical type experience. However, on the other end of the spectrum, you do get reports that fit all of the criteria for a classic mystical type experience and are described as transformative or life-changing. So there is a spectrum of intensity and impact of these experiences. And that's why careful research is needed to really drill down and get into what people mean when they say, yes, I've had one of these experiences.
While I still hold to the fact that finding a good parking place in Boston is miraculous, and it definitely fills me with a sense of peace, David's point is a good one. If we're going to study these experiences scientifically, there needs to be some agreement about what constitutes one. And for researchers, that definition starts from one of the founding fathers of modern psychology.
William James talked about mystical experience, and what he was referring to was substantially altered states of consciousness that occur briefly. He calls them transient, so from a few minutes to at most a couple of hours or so, involving a sense of passivity. So the experience is overwhelming. It's not like you just decide to have one of these experiences like you decide to move your arm. It comes over you. Ineffability, this idea that the experience goes beyond words, and an inability to express aspects of it, and then a noetic quality. So this feeling of deep meaning, like you touch something very real and important. There are other points that he makes about these mystical type experiences having to do with feelings of connectedness or unity and a sense of sacredness.
And there's at least some evidence that these feelings of connectedness may be reflected in what's going on in our brains.
My old colleague, Andy Newberg, did some of the pioneering neuroimaging work on meditators and nuns and people who are purportedly able to put themselves into a mystical state. And he reports that this region that typically models bodily boundaries is conspicuously quiet during these experiences, which then makes good neurological sense for why people feel this enhanced sense of connectedness, because their boundaries are less clear, so to speak, where there are notable inhibitions.
Our understanding of neuroscience in general, let alone the neuroscience of self-transcendence, is still in its early stages. But findings like this do support the idea that real, meaningful activity is going on in the brain that is altering our conscious experience of ourselves. And that may be why people all over the world report having these experiences. Across cultures, there are a lot of differences in the kinds of things people see, hear, and feel in these moments, and in how they interpret them. But there's also a lot of similarity. Feelings of being present, at peace, or in a state of supreme connection to everyone. But that commonality raises another question. If mystical experiences are pan-human, why do we have them? Are we wired for transcendence? And by that I mean, did we evolve to have these experiences because they serve an adaptive function? Or are they what evolutionary biologists would call a spandrel? A trait that's just a coincidental offshoot of some other mechanism that evolved to help us pass on our genes.
The choices are interesting. So some believe that our tendency or capacity to have these kinds of experiences is a spandrel, maybe even having to do with the sexual system, something like an repurposed orgasm or an experience that uses some of that underlying brain circuitry. That's possible. That's interesting. And in that view, these experiences would not have been selected for. I think it's also possible that these experiences could be something like an emergency panic button, where when things get very, very difficult, these experiences kick in and restore a sense of hope and optimism. There's a Scottish explorer who was literally in the jaws of a lion, being shaken and being near death, who had this overwhelming mystical experience. He ended up surviving the event and felt extremely grateful for it, despite almost dying, because of this state and the profundity and the positivity of the state. So there's a whole literature on these experiences occurring to people who are near death. And despite what we would think of as the suffering and the shock and the trauma of being near death, people end up feeling grateful for the experience overall because it elicited this amazing experience. Others, like John Haidt, for example, thinks that when you look from a group selection perspective, groups who had more of these kinds of experiences, or individuals who had more of these experiences, would tend to be more cohesive, because these experiences do, not always, but overall, tend to increase prosocial behavior and feelings of connection with close others. And so the speculation is, well, maybe groups who had more of these experiences going on would be more cohesive, more cooperative, and thus more successful.
Sometimes when I'm giving a talk, I say, think of the most profound experience you've ever had. And lo and behold, those are the experiences that are mystical.
Dr. Robert Foreman has been studying mysticism for a long time. He was a professor of religion for many years. I actually took a class with him as an undergrad, way back when I still had hair. He now provides spiritual counseling focused on what he calls the transformative power of direct experience, and has written many books on mysticism and interviewed lots of people about their experiences. He's also had several of his own in his many years as a meditator and spiritual seeker. But while he may not be studying this stuff in the lab like David Yaden, he's come to a lot of the same conclusions.
Mystical experiences are moments when you are completely present to who you are, what you are, and wide open inside. And they tend to be some of the most joyous, profound experiences people have ever had.
What's the relation between these mystical experiences and one's spiritual life? Can you have them completely outside of any faith tradition? Or conversely, if you're not in a faith tradition, can they sometimes make people open to what we'd call a more spiritual path?
Some of the most deeply spiritual people I know are agnostics. I'm not sure that you need to be in a religion to have one of these experiences. I mean, Csikszentmihalyi used to say that being in the flow, you could be religious and you could be non-religious and still be in that sort of experience.
The research backs Foreman up here. According to David Yaden, people who identify as religious or spiritual tend to have more of these experiences than people who don't. But atheists and agnostics have a lot of them too. And even though they're less likely to interpret them as a message from the divine, what they say about how the experience feels is essentially the same. So, what's the real role of religion here?
I think, to tell you the truth, and this is some of my thinking here, I think that the mystical experience is what people are pointing to in their religious life. I think the only difference between religion and just the guy that's in runner's high, running down I don't know, the Charles River in Boston, is that the religious systems present themselves as having a way to get your life more in alignment with these experiences. Get such experiences more, but also get yourself in alignment. Meditation is designed to help you find or to fall into these experiences. And I think what Christian ritual and Jewish ritual and Muslim ritual is about, I think these rituals are designed to both foster this transformation of life, but also to remind us that this is what we're after. I think people definitely can have these experiences whether or not they're religious. I think having a systematic reminder and a systematic way to bring these kinds of phenomena about, I think that's where religion comes to life. But I don't think it's the only way.
You're making a good point. When I think about religion, I think when a lot of people think about religion, we're often focused on the creedal aspects of it, what people believe, as opposed to the doing aspects and those rituals and practices. But when I think of a lot of religions, especially, and you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, more of the Abrahamic faith, a lot of it seems very liturgical, as opposed to providing people with the tools to have these experiences. You know, you can find it cloistered away in the Christian tradition, in the abbeys and the Christian mystics. But most Sunday services, it's not there. And it's not a route that is provided easily to most people. So if the goal of religion, or one goal of it, is to help us have these experiences, why do you think it's not made as readily available to a lot of people?
Well, Dave, I'm not sure if I've told you this, but the book I'm working on right now, tentatively called Christianity for Modern Times, grew out of my own experience of going to church. A friend of mine invited me to her church, and lo and behold, I started to have very powerful experiences in that church. I started to weep. And I've gone back to a Christian church now every Sunday for 8.5 years, and I have continued to cry every single time. And the interesting thing about it is I have never, ever accepted a single line from the creed. It's like, I believe in God, the creator of heaven and earth. And I go, nah, I don't believe in that. Jesus was born of a virgin. Nah, I don't. And then because I was thinking, is it just me, this weird guy? I started to interview people. I've probably interviewed 50, 55 people now that also go to church and also do not buy the system as it's handed to us. So there is a large number of people. I've now spoken in a church just last week. That was the first time I spoke in a church about all this. And after the church service, people started coming up to me and they said, yeah, I'm one of your people. And they all whispered it because nobody wants to acknowledge it to their fellow man. I think there's more of this in church than we quite realize.
I want to get a little more clarity on the experience that you're having, which sounds pretty profound to have every week. I mean, as listeners will know, I was raised Catholic. I was an altar boy. I never once had one of these experiences.
It's like I walk into this space and it's like my chest opens. That's my best way to describe it. I'm readier to feel whatever I feel. It happens to me often when I'm listening to the music, be it the choir or the organ, and I feel like the music is so beautiful, I simply can't contain it. My heart is just so full that I just weep. So once I remember I was looking at a woman, a baby was being baptized, and I was watching this woman interact with her child before the baptism. And I just began to weep. It was so beautiful the way this mother was with her child. Sometimes I weep over people, watching people process down the aisle, to see human beings so well organized, not fighting to be the most important or the first in place. I think if there's a sort of common theme to what sets me off like this, it's that I see people reaching beyond themselves, cooperating beyond themselves.
There are a lot of different ways to be touched by the transcendent. You might be surrounded by people and music in the middle of a religious ceremony when it happens. Or you could be alone in the forest on mile 5 of a morning run. Sometimes these moments feel really big and emotional. Other times more quiet and open. But one thing they have in common is they often feel like they shift something important in you. During his 40 years practicing meditation, Foreman had several of these experiences. So I asked him, did they change him?
What I think people expect is you think your personality is going to become wonderful, you're going to become so sweet, everything will go easy for you. And that wasn't at all what had happened to me. I was continuing to feel anxious. I was continuing to feel confused. I got depressed sometimes. It hadn't changed me in any obvious way that I could see. But over the years, what I began to realize is that the kind of thing that might have upset me before, the kind of thing that might have made me anxious or made me, self-critical or whatnot, no longer sort of overwhelmed me in the same way they had. Sometimes I think about it like I was a sailboat on the sea, and if a big wind had come, the wind would just sort of knock me over. And then after some years, it was like I had more of a keel. And when the strong wind would come, I would find myself more stable and more ready to deal with whatever it was in a reasonably sane way.
Do you think it changed what you valued in terms of your outlook on life, like what was important?
Yeah. I grew up in a relatively straightforward, middle-class Jewish home. And the philosophy that I began to take on as a meditator was not like a monotheism, not like Judaism. So in the sense of my beliefs, I started to think about things more as if there was an more abstract, not personal, sense of unseen reality beneath reality. And I think that I became less oriented towards wealth and success and more oriented towards living in a way that was, I don't know quite how to say this, fuller of integrity. There's probably a word for that. I began to feel like living up to my word and being consistent and coherent in my life and being able to love more became my life's work, as opposed to thinking about how I can earn an extra $500,000.
David Yadin's dorm room experience also had profound and lasting effects on him.
My experience changed dramatically my view of how interesting and compelling my own future could be. And it changed me from having a fairly dismal view of myself and the world to a substantially less dismal view.
Now, as a scientist, let me ask you why, because you completely, I'm sure, would agree with me that the world around you did not change before and after that moment.
Right. Well, so directly after my experience, I interpreted it in a religious or spiritual way. I was in my early undergrad years, so I didn't really have a sense for the different kinds of interpretations that were available. I now interpret it in a purely agnostic way, leaning towards a more naturalistic explanation. So there's a bit of this interpretive element that could have been at play, but I tend to think that the changes were lower and deeper and more important than that level of things. I think we often overplay the role of beliefs, whereas what I felt was more awe and wonder for the world, whatever the case may be about its ultimate nature, more fascinated in small things. And maybe this is the major thing, much more connected to family and friends who I was already connected to, but feeling the viscerality of connectedness and love without those artificial boundaries. That was, I think, the major component. And that has, I think, made an impact very positively on my life to this very day.
We do live at a time where a lot of people are feeling disconnected from one another. The loneliness epidemic is something we hear about in the news again and again. And also, especially in younger adults, rising feelings of anxiety and depression and hopelessness, things coming from climate change and economic inequality. I'm wondering, you noted that these experiences change people's views and can give them hope. And I'm never one to want to create false hope or give people a panacea. But sometimes to be active in the world, to make change, you have to feel like it's possible and that you care. And so I'm wondering, do you think there's a role for people even seeking more of these mystical experiences in that vein? And if they were interested in doing so, how might they start?
The emotion of awe is interesting in this context. I call awe the every person's spiritual experience because while maybe only 35% or so of the population has had one of these dramatic, transformative experiences, I think most of us feel awe once every week or so, and that we naturally seek out awe. Think about a vacation that you plan. Yeah, you'll have some food and drink and pleasure, but most of us plan to visit a museum or climb a mountain or to see some live music. And I think seeking out awe with others is one way to have a flavor or a sense for these kinds of experiences, even if they're not dramatic and intense and transformative. But there's good evidence for awe, for well-being and more social connectedness.
Awe is definitely one way in. Deckard Keltner talked to us about awe last season. It's a feeling of being wide open, yet small, of feeling wonder and in the presence of something greater than yourself. And both religion and the secular world provide ways to evoke it. Witnessing or hearing stories about noble acts can do it. So too can dancing or singing together, or even seeing natural or artistic beauty. Robert Foreman also has some ideas about what we can do to help open ourselves up to having more profound experiences.
I think there are two practices, if you will, that seem to be helping people. The first is the practice of having the intention of opening up, to recognize, here's where I'm caught, here's where I'm trapped, here's where my psychological attachments are. I need to be important. I need to be wealthy. I need to be blah, blah, blah. And if people are recognizing that has them caught, has them trapped, those are what it is we need to be able to let go of somewhat in order to open ourselves up to this sense of being more wide open to the world, more wide open to this sense of connection. So that having the intention to free oneself is a huge piece of this. And the second thing is, I think, being with others who you believe are present, wherever that is. If it's in a church, then you're looking for people in the church that you believe are being really serious about their spiritual life. I'm thinking of an interview I had with a Swedish woman who said that when I'm with people who are present, it's much easier to be present. And when we're off that keel, when we're off that line, somehow I think we can get distracted. You asked before about, how did religion get to be so creedal? And I think people getting off that path of really being fully present, I think has fostered that sense of we're just doing it by rote.
We are at a period in time right now, at least in the United States, where people are leaving traditional faiths in droves, right? It was recently the first time since Gallup started measuring that the majority of people didn't belong to a church, a mosque, or a synagogue. But most of them aren't becoming atheists. Often there's basically saying, I'm spiritual, but not religious, because I think they are looking for this type of connection or experience or meaning in life. But are we going to find it? If religion oftentimes provides a framework to do it and not for everyone, and, religious institutions have many failures, I'm the first to admit that. I'm no apologist for them. But are we making it harder in some ways for ourselves to have these experiences?
The reason I'm writing my book, frankly, is that I think Christianity, and God knows Christianity has had its problems over the years and still does, but to be in a religion in which other people come together, I think really helps this process. And what I've discovered is that you can be part of the process and not have to buy all the language, not have to buy things that you can't. As I said earlier on, I don't believe any of these words, but I do believe in the process of coming together with others, and I find it very beautiful. And I find the music very moving, and I find other people's coming together just a really inspiring piece of what it is to be a human being. I think we've lost a lot when we've said, oh, all institutions are crap. I think that's been a real loss for us as a civilization, and certainly as an American society. And I hope that my writing and other people's writings are beginning to show people that you don't have to be quite so put off by the stuff that drives you a little bonkers about religion.
There's a caution here, a familiar one involving a baby and bathwater. The doing of religion, its rituals, music, and practices, offers tools that can help point us toward deeply spiritual experiences. But if we reject all parts of religion because of a disagreement about a belief or an institutional failing, we're closing off one route to the mystical. As Foreman said, you don't have to buy everything about a faith to use it as a vehicle to self-transcendence. In fact, many of the people we'd call true mystics didn't. They were often a bit outside of the mainstream of their respective faiths, yet they still found the sublime within it. But the truth they recognized, and one that's important for all of us to remember, is that even the experience of transcendence itself isn't the ultimate goal.
I think what we're after is not a particular experience, but rather a particular kind of life. I know I'm interested in expressing the love that I experience sometimes in church, in more and more of my life. I know that in my meditation life, I'm interested in living out that sense of stability I was describing earlier, the sense of being part of something large, something larger than me. I think it is possible to have, if you will, your neurophysiology transformed such that this is part of the background of your life. This is who you are. And I think that can be permanent.
As a scientist, I'll be the first to say that we don't really know what's going on when people have these experiences. Are they just neurons firing in a novel way? Or are they states that give us a glimpse into greater truths and parts of reality that normally remain unseen? To tell you the truth, I'm not sure we'll ever know with certainty. But in some ways, it doesn't really matter. What does, and what's incontrovertible, is that these experiences usually change people for the better. Because while they connect us with something mysterious, they also anchor us to our humanity. They nudge us to see the wonder, the beauty, the love in each other. Next time on How God Works.
If you watch anxious people, you'll start watching how they breathe. They huff and puff. And that gets them really worked up. But if they reverse that and took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, the vagus can start doing its job.
When we change how we breathe, we change how we feel. And that's a reason why spiritual traditions the world over have been using breath work before that term was even invented.
Breath has always been connected with spirit and with God. I mean, without breath, there is no life.
How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. If you want to learn more, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, .org, or follow me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.